And welcome. Thank you so much for joining myself and each other here today, where we are going to be talking even more about tribal partnerships as prevention. Really, thankful that I was able to sit in on the main session, the conversation that we all just came from, because hopefully a lot of this conversation will continue to build on some of what we've already heard here this morning. My name is Geneva Shaw, and I am here today representing the California Tribal Families Coalition. I will talk a little bit more about who the coalition is and the work that we do. But first of all, I just want to do a little bit of introduction of self. I am a social worker. I am coming to you today from Humboldt County, where I live and where I work out of. More specifically, I am tuning in from the beautiful homelands of the Wiyot peoples. I myself am an enrolled tribal member of the Hoopa Valley tribe and also come from Karuk and Yurok peoples who all live in and around the Humboldt County area and region. I am very privileged, blessed to be, living, raising my family, building my professional pathway in the place that, my people have come from since the beginning of time. I certainly, consider that a great privilege and honor. And with that comes also a lot of responsibility, responsibility to honor those that came before me, responsibility to make sure I do my part to ensure a better future for those who have yet to come after me, and to invest in the community and the communities that have invested so much in myself for me to even be here with all of you today. I encourage you all, if you are open, to also drop in the chat where you're tuning in from, and also if you're able to take that one step further, whose homelands you are tuning in from. And if you are unsure, to perhaps go back and do a little bit of that work and homework after our time together today. So again, appreciate all of you spending the time with me over the course of the next hour. So I mentioned California Tribal Families Coalition. A little bit more about myself. So in addition to my work as the training director at CTFC, or the coalition as we interchangeably refer to it as, I also have been teaching full-time for the last decade in the social work department at Cal Poly Humboldt. Prior to my work in these two spaces, I really consider myself to have been really raised professionally as a professional social worker by the Yurok tribe. The Yurok tribe is the largest tribe in California by membership. There, I had the opportunity to serve as a tribal social worker, an ICWA social worker, as well as a social services director and administrator. So that's where I really kind of sunk into my career doing work in and around the child welfare field, and specifically with the Indian Child Welfare Act. That certainly wasn't necessarily what I anticipated when I kind of started off my social work education and career, but really that has translated to my heart work. This is work that I consider, a lifetime of work that I feel really honored to be a part of, and really helping to do whatever part I can to engage in child welfare reform, specifically as it relates to hopefully increasing better outcomes for tribal children and families, and certainly all children and families. But my emphasis is specifically working in and around tribal space and governments in the social services field. A bit about California Tribal Families Coalition. Our work also very much centered in child welfare space here in California. Also specific emphasis to tribal or Indian child welfare. We do work in kind of three lanes or baskets, as we sometimes refer to them as. We do work in the space of policy and legislation. We do work in the legal arena as it relates to ICWA compliance, both in direct representation of tribes, as well as in participating and leading the way in high impact litigation. And then my work is really around, training and curriculum development. So we not only train child welfare workforces, we also in all of those baskets do a lot of work in the way of tribal capacity building. So working directly with tribes, as well as really all professionals who interface with, child welfare systems here in California. And sometimes that branches us out, right? Because we are not just, an isolated field or system, venturing out into juvenile justice space, venturing out into developmental and intellectual disability space, and others that interface education space, that interface with child welfare and how that impacts children and families. I encourage you, if you're interested, to take a look at our website too. I have it listed here, caltribalfamilies.org, where you can find other resources related to training, related to policy and legislation, publications, pre-recorded webinars, and just other kind of updates that you might want to be aware of that are happening in and around the state. So before we begin, I just wanted to touch on a little bit of the history of Native California. Now, some of what was kind of mentioned in our opening session and conversation was really knowing and acknowledging the history of this place, the history of the places that we live, the history of the places that we work, the history of the places that we love, where we spend our free time, where we, raise our families, where we are, just enjoying the beautiful landscape of the places that we call home, whether, a temporary home or a long time home. Really understanding kind of who the peoples are that come from these places, not only in the historical context around kind of what has happened in these places, but also getting to know the realities of the contemporary aspects of the peoples who come from these places as well. How are peoples thriving? How are peoples surviving? In what ways are the peoples of these places leading the way in environmental stewardship, for example, or in the, restoring wellness and balance to communities, in really kind of protecting and preserving and revitalizing languages and cultures? I think there is a lot to be said about really embracing kind of the resilience and resistance and leadership of tribal peoples in the communities around us, so that we can have a better appreciation and also have a more balanced relationship with the peoples that we serve, right? It's important to really understand and acknowledge Indigenous trauma and suffering and the histories of colonization that contributed to, but we also have to balance that with having more opportunities to embrace and have access to and interface with, Indigenous brilliance and success and leadership, so that we can really appreciate and really build our capacity around, what is referred to as cultural humility. A little bit of information here, just to give you a little bit of context if you don't already have this, just what, that landscape is here in California. So we are a very, populous state as it relates to our American Indian population and Alaska Native population. Of the 574 federally recognized tribes throughout the United States, 109 of those tribes exist here in California. Some counties have many, many federally recognized tribes. Some counties have no federally recognized tribes within their jurisdiction, but that doesn't mean that there aren't an abundance of tribal peoples within each of our respective regions and jurisdictions. Certainly, as was mentioned and emphasized this morning too, there are also many tribal groups that are still unfederally recognized. And certainly, giving reverence and respect to those peoples as well, and acknowledging that all of these different peoples that exist here in California all come from have very diverse histories, diverse languages, cultures, and certainly, again, kind of taking us into the contemporary diverse governance structures, social services, funding streams, and more. So really kind of part of our work is building some awareness and familiarity with tribes local to our region, as well as understanding kind of the history of, representation. Oh, somebody I need to mute. Oops, sorry. Also understanding, kind of the experience of many peoples who come from tribes out of state, and also digging into some of that history around how that, in part came to be through various federal policies and deliberate acts to take tribal peoples off their homelands and kind of move them into very urban and populous centers, and really kind of what that history of community building has and continues to look like in our very urban spaces with tribes represented from throughout the nation. So, you know, a little bit of a different kind of dynamic here in California, where we have 109 federally recognized tribes, you know, indigenous to these places, but also, you know, all tribal peoples from all over the United States represented very robustly here in California as well. I want to start with this 13-minute video. For those of you who come with a lot of, you know, knowledge and background about the history of Native California, much of this is not going to be new to you, but I also want to start, you know, if you haven't had an opportunity to learn a lot of the history, I kind of wanted to start with a little bit of that foundation for us all to collectively build from. And a little bit about this video, it was developed out of Cal Poly Humboldt, again, where I also am connected to. And part of the intended purpose of this film was a bit of an orientation video. So for example, there are place-based learning communities at Cal Poly Humboldt that really focus on the natural resources. Partnerships have been built between the university and local tribes to really do place-based education, right? To get students out in the field, tending to and learning about the places in and around kind of the university and really engaging in hands-on learning. But part of the piece about responsibly doing that learning is first understanding kind of the history and the peoples of this place, the history as well as, again, the contemporary context of the peoples of this place. So we're not just coming as learners and taking, right? We're understanding our collective responsibility to engage in reciprocity and giving back to place, and ideally leaving place better and stronger than we found it. And we're not kind of coming in with this like consumer mentality, right? We're a part of something that's a bigger collective. And not just, you know, how we navigate the world isn't just about who we are as an individual, but really like what are our actions? How do our actions impact something much greater than ourselves? And not only, you know, existing in this moment in time, but how are our actions also impacting future generations as it relates to place, again, living, learning, growing, and hopefully creating a better world. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing this screen, and I'm going to pivot over to this 13-minute video, and we will go from there. So I'm going to stop share, and then I will reshare.
For California Indian history specifically, I think it's important for people to know that California has always been a populous place. It's home right now to 109 to 111 tribes, but back then you're talking about tribes everywhere. There is no empty space of wilderness that exists in this place that we currently call California. The way you know that there were California Indians everywhere is that every place had a name. There was not mountain or a field or a region that there wasn't a tribe who had already named it. For the sciences, I think that the land bridge theory has always been sort of a first point of knowledge about Native people. But there have been new studies that have shown that there was humans in this side of the Americas over 100,000 years ago, which would mean that that is around the same amount of time in which they say people were sort of first leaving Africa. And so we are asking people to complicate how they understand who we are as Indigenous peoples here. What we say is we're from this place.
And that's a real and true belief that we have. We are a part of the land and the land is us, and we didn't migrate from some other place. We've always been there.
We've always been a part of our land and not above it, not below it, but equal to, and we have our role. Our roles come from that engagement and come from seeing what needs to be done to make things the best way that they can be.
So all of this is very important for people to understand, because I think sometimes they think Californian people are here, but they're not really doing much with the space. There's so much evidence of like agriculture. There's evidence of large areas in which they're tending to. There's evidence of ways in which they're shaping what we now think of the natural landscape. And then colonization happened.
I joined law enforcement because I care deeply about our communities. Their safety is always my
Sorry about that.
Happens. Most California scholars, they call it invasion. So we're being invaded.
When Cabrillo was first on one of his ships in 1500s, burning of the land is what actually gave away people on that land. That was like the first thing that, colonizers saw was our traditional burnings of the lands.
You're talking about 3 waves of destruction. From the start of these waves, there's not really a time period in which California Indians can recover from what's happening to them. So the first wave of destruction is the Spanish mission system. They build the first mission in San Diego. There's 21 missions that they build in total. This is Father Junipero Serra. And they're bringing people into the missions in the hopes that they can create this labor force to be able to establish this extension of Spain. The mission system is effectively an enslavement system of California Indian people. The missionaries bring along with them Spanish soldiers. The soldiers are written about in these records as being perpetrators of sexual violence, not only against women, but also children. Junipero Serra actually talks about that in his journals. He's like, they are sexually assaulting women and children in front of people. And when people try to stop them, they get shot. I mean, it's a very violent type of situation. The mission system sort of stops around San Francisco. And so up here in Northern California, what they say about us is we were contacted relatively late in the sort of colonization cycle. We had contact with some explorers who had come through, people that were looking mostly for gold. And at a point they find gold. And this is where you get these sort of like massive influx of the gold rush.
And it just came like overnight, and it came in hard. And life just changed drastically and just immediately in a lot of ways for California people.
They're not here so that they can set up a colony or so that they can establish a labor force. They want gold. They will kill whoever is in the way. They will take apart whatever needs to be taken apart. They'll do whatever it takes. The thing about the gold rush that people don't think about is that it was actually an environmental destruction as well. And then on top of that, they are setting up a political system and a state system of laws and governance that will legalize the genocide that they want to commit against California Indian people.
Our first lieutenant governor, Peter Burnett, saw this huge population of Indians in the state. And so he's the one that, charged the war of extermination on the California Indians. And we lost, probably around 80% of our total population. And it's just a short period of years.
The early settlers wanted the resources. They wanted what would make them rich faster. But instead of asking the tribe to help them or assist them, they said, well, since tribe probably won't just give to us, we're just going to wipe them out. We're going to massacre them. We're going to take everything for ourselves.
Each region of California is allowed to set their own sort of what are we going to pay for a scalp or a head. But when you look at advertisements, what you see is that they're advertising them at things like $5 a head and 25 cents per scalp. The first year that they do this, they pay $1 million. The state of California says that it has paid $1 million for killing Indian people. The second year they do it, it's $1 million. In this region, every single tribe in this region would have some kind of stories about the violence that came out of the gold rush. My great grandfather, you know, his family is from Kadu country. His great uncle his mom had lived through the gold rush, and he was born sort of like at the tail end of this period of time. And he would always say to my mother, you know, remember, granddaughter, you're here because some miner was a bad shot. Like, that's how close it is to who we are.
When modern contact, we had to forget about all our relations. We had to forget about all the sciences. We had to forget about all the philosophies. We had to forget about everything that was ingrained from us for thousands of years to a shattered existence.
They would take your kids from your family and take them to boarding schools and assimilate you. You were not to practice your cultures. You're not to practice your traditions. You're supposed to practice, you know, I hate to say it this way, the white man's religion. We're going to Christianize you. You're going to follow our God.
I know that I'm a product of forced assimilation. I know I was stripped of some of the smartest information a human being could have. And I know I don't have that now. But I know it's attainable over time. And we're on the right path.
There's all these great moments of Native people making sure that they were trying to hold on to things, like fighting back and making plans for the future. It's palpable in Humboldt County.
The Native American community, and especially the Weats and the surrounding tribes, were put through a lot. It wasn't just the Weats, it was Hurok, Hoopa, you know, we were all put through a lot during the early years. Here we are, we're growing. We're becoming a stronger nations. We're working together with each other to create a positive thing. And not only us working with each other's sister tribes, we're working with the cities, the governments that surround us, the schools, HSU, to make this more positive.
Humboldt State University is within the Aboriginal territory of the Wiyot people. And then we have several other large tribes around here, the three largest in California, the Karuk, the Yurok, and the Hoopa. So being that we are in the backyard of three of the largest tribes, we can draw off and partner with some of our local tribes to bring that extra educational component to our STEM and natural resource students. Here at the Indian Natural Resource Science and Engineering Program and Diversity in STEM, we go by Intercept Plus. Our services generally provide navigational suggestions to students, assisting them navigate the College of Natural Resources and Sciences. We often are enriching that experience with extracurricular activities coming from an Indigenous perspective. So bringing up our ancestors' practices and techniques of managing landscapes, melding them or braiding them in with the scientific method and innovative technologies.
In Native studies, we're doing a sort of broad spectrum of what it's like to learn from Indigenous peoples and cultures and knowledges so that we can build a better world, build a better way of knowing. It's about how we learn with and from Native people instead of disciplines historically that have focused on the study of Native American people.
My paternal grandmother was one of the founders of the Indian Tribal Education Personnel Program, the ITEP, back in the late 60s and early 70s. Her and a bunch of other mothers and grandmothers, they were the ones that kind of started a lot of our other community programs, our healthcare programs, our education programs. I always think it's a pretty amazing story because a lot of those women, her included, had attended boarding schools. And for those women to come back from that and still understand that we needed health and we needed education and we needed a strong community.
When you talk about the Indian Tribal Educational Personnel Program and United Indian Health Services having these women with moxie, they come from a generation of women who have been having to just hold that strength for such a long time. And part of the work as tribal people is how do we go back and tap into that? Because that's always there. We come from a long line of those folks who are moving forward and have had to keep their dignity, keep their pride. And although it hurts, we're still doing that work. That's what I try to tap in for the young people, tribal people in particular, but also for non-Indian students to hear that too, that it's not all historical trauma and then we're gone. No, it's historical trauma. We're still here and we're not going anywhere. We're still learning. We're still enduring.
Right, I'm going to jump back over to the PowerPoint and we will pick up on our conversation. So one of the things, well, many things that I really appreciate about that video that I think we can really draw upon and build from, and you can Google, it's right on YouTube. It's called History of Native California. I do have it embedded in the PowerPoint here, but you can also, pull that up right on YouTube. Please, like if you find value and use in sharing that within your networks and within your sphere of influence, please, I encourage you to do so. Especially an orientation video, even, when you're bringing on and onboarding new staff or, bringing folks into this kind of tribal collaboration work, having some tools and resources to help folks at least start from a similar kind of baseline in terms of some of their background knowledge and information. Certainly I've learned over the years not to assume that folks have had that type of education or training in public education school systems or even in their higher education journeys. So I think it's always important to just kind of start from that baseline and foundation, and certainly, never hurts to kind of refresh ourselves too, and reground ourselves on some of the, not just history, but also some of the contemporary strengths of Native California. So many things that I appreciate, and I think there's certainly some parallels we can draw from, which include one, kind of really honoring the resilience, right? So kind of understanding all that peoples have endured here in our own communities, certainly throughout the state and throughout the nation, gives us a better respect for the work that tribal folks are doing in the way of prevention, whether it be cultural preservation or building, community-based resources and services. Really towards the end of that, we're talking, Paula Tripp Allen was really talking about, women who came out of boarding schools and still understood the value and the need for healthcare and systems of wellness and education in our communities, really emphasizing that tribal peoples have always been engaged in prevention work. We've been doing so without the funding, without the policy and legislative backing, without, the publicly funded, streams of support. Tribal peoples have always been engaged in that work because that's who we are, building for our future generations, building upon and strengthening. So as, our systems have kind of been catching up to that, it's created a lot of opportunity for potential partnerships. And it's come with a lot of mistakes or missteps too, right? We're still learning in this work. We still have a long ways to go. And I'm thankful that we're here together doing that. I also appreciate in this film that it really does kind of pull us into the contemporary and really gives us some examples of what peoples are doing and active in real time. I encourage us to, again, kind of dig into the histories of the places that we are working, but also really providing opportunities or creating opportunities to interface with what tribal folks and tribal communities and governments and organizations are doing in the space of prevention, right? In the space of revitalization, so that we can really understand kind of how to support some of that work. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Many examples of Native resilience. Again, I've touched upon some of these, the revitalization of cultural practices and languages. Culture is such the heart and foundation of prevention in tribal communities, in my opinion. I've seen reconnecting to culture as the pathway to really change the trajectory of family systems, to create opportunities for families to break cycles of system involvement, for example, that reconnection to tribal community, tribal culture, and tribal family is incredibly powerful and has a ton of potential healing properties. There are many instances of active politicization and resistance all throughout our state. You know, the advocacy and activism that tribal folks are engaged in, not just for the benefit of tribal peoples, but for the benefit of all peoples, right? We heard that in the film too. This responsibility that we have to create a better world. When we talk about this responsibility to create a better world, we're talking about a better world for all peoples. I come from a people that are considered fix the earth people. As Kaduk people, that's a part of the foundation of our belief system, of our cosmology, of our creation stories, and of our ceremonial responsibility. We are fix the earth people, and that is fixing the earth for all peoples. The ways that we engage in ceremony, the ways that we engage in everything that contributes and leads up to and after ceremony is all to fix the earth and restore balance to the earth for all peoples. We see a lot of beautiful examples throughout the state of kind of examples of land back initiatives and movements. For example, the renaming of public space, such as state parks, the co-stewardship of places like I saw this last year, I remember seeing in the headlines, agreement between 29 Palms Tribe and Joshua Tree National Park engaging in a partnership to go co-steward that place that those peoples have existed in since the beginning of time in a way that benefits all peoples, right? So many examples of how these agreements and these partnerships are translating in a better world for all. We see many instances, and I hope that you're able to access and kind of, you know, experience some of the ways that communities around you are returning to traditional values and community-based practices, right? This prevention work, kind of tapping into the medicines that have existed in community since the beginning of time and really translating that to contemporary challenges to create contemporary solutions. We see many efforts to return to traditional child rearing practices and rites of passage rituals so that we can really bring up young people in ways that really foster optimal success, right? And how we build that into our systems. I've seen examples where county child welfare systems have actually purchased traditional baby baskets so that when a baby comes into care, that family who's providing that care for that child is able to rear them in a traditional baby basket in the ways that, you know, our babies are meant to be reared, right? Or creating opportunities for young people to have access to and create various rites of passage, whether it be ceremonial items or just experiences of being present. I think these are really innovative solutions for, you know, contemporary challenges that have been oftentimes created in part by structures of governance, right? And past harmful policies and practices that have contributed to our families being disconnected from each other, from our land bases, and certainly from our cultural practices. We've seen for decades and generations the founding of organizations and services to help our families and communities, you know, strive towards wellness, right? We're building our own solutions. So much happening. So the question therein lies, how do we as state, county-based systems, you know, nonprofits, whomever we are representing, how do we tap in and support what's already working, right? How do we uplift and champion what tribes, tribal communities, tribal orgs, and service providers are already doing that works? And then certainly, how are we allies to strengthening tribal sovereignty? What is our role in supporting and uplifting tribes as sovereign nations? And how are we being a partner to that rather than being systems or agencies that are limiting tribal sovereignty? And we see this happening in a variety of ways. Again, tribes having to kind of fit into a box that is not their own box, that limits and hinders tribal sovereignty and the ability for tribes to truly make decisions and self-determine in ways that they know is best for their own peoples and communities. I also want to acknowledge that a lot of this effort and these actions and these acts are also very grassroots. Some of them may certainly be connected to tribal governance and tribal organizations, but some of this effort is also very kind of coming from community. So, there is a spectrum of how a lot of this Native resilience looks and shows up within our communities. I want to touch on a little bit about tribal sovereignty. Certainly, again, this is also something that is not necessarily reflected in our public education curriculum, something that maybe isn't very touched on in our own journeys of higher education. We learn about the 3 branches of government, we learn about the US Constitution, but unfortunately there isn't always a tribal component to that, as there should be. Now, certainly there's efforts across the state to kind of shift and change that, because as tribal peoples, we're always pushing for systems change. We're always pushing to have ourselves represented in kind of the mainstream base of knowledge as it should be. So again, efforts happening there, but I'm going to pivot us to a short video, and then we'll talk a little bit about tribal sovereignty, either as a recap or for some of us, maybe things that we are still learning about. So quick stop share, and I'll reshare, and then we'll pick up where we left off after a quick 5-minute video.
I think not many people know that treaties were signed. That might be it.
A treaty is fundamentally an agreement between 2 nations.
Treaties are only made between sovereign governments.
In fact, the US has made more than 300 treaties with American Indian nations.
The United States' existence when it first won the war against Great Britain was very precarious, and many countries around the world did not recognize the United States' sovereignty.
So the US, as a way to assert that it was a sovereign, it made agreements with Native nations to sort of say to Europe, to Britain, hey, we're sovereign too, we can make these agreements.
The idea that treaties somehow gave status or standing or land to indigenous nations is probably the main fallacy that exists.
I think that many people view treaties as special rights for Indians.
They're not rights given to Native nations. They're Native nations, by and large, giving rights to the United States. I think a lot of people lack an understanding that wherever they live, there's probably a treaty that gives them the right to live there, granted to them by Native nations.
A nation relinquished its the majority of its land rights, its land holdings, its resource holdings, for the right to preserve its way of life.
The rights that are reserved are more easily defined by the US courts as property rights, but better defined by our traditional and cultural understandings as being relationship rights to the land, the water, and all of the beings that we hunt and fish and share that world with.
It's through treaties that I think we've been able to hold off a lot of forces that would like to see us erased from the continent.
I'm trying to think of one treaty that from the perspective of the indigenous nation has been fully upheld and implemented.
A lot of people disregard our treaties and say they're a thing of the past, they've been broken, let's forget about them. They would like to wipe away the treaty history of the United States, but that's simply not how it works.
Our United States Constitution recognizes that once a treaty is signed and ratified by the Senate, it becomes the quote, supreme law of the land.
What that means is that a treaty, it's as much alive as the US Constitution is.
Are they living documents? Do they exist and do they transcend generations? The answer is absolutely yes.
When people question the relevance of treaties and say, I don't think treaties are relevant, my response is, then just give us the land back.
We're not talking about past history. We're talking about today. The best example of that is the Dakota Access Pipeline.
I think we saw before the world community the violation of the 1868 and 1851 treaties of the United States with the Lakota nation in Standing Rock.
It brought the violation of treaty rights to today. Even though tribes have been experiencing those violations time after time after time,
treaties go both ways.
This was a two-way street, that it was a shared history.
It's about mutual respect.
Non-native peoples are treaty partners, the descendants of the treaty signers, you could say, on the United States side.
I think that the way that we bring everybody into the conversation is we have curriculum that accurately reflects the reality of what an Indian treaty is. That's something we do for the United States Constitution and the three branches of government. Why don't we have a tribal component to that education?
The ancestors who negotiated the treaties, they were doing their best to protect us, to protect our culture and protect our way of life.
And to me, that's a responsibility and a way in which I should live my life every day, to remember to honor those ancestors that fought so I could be here today.
Treaties are living documents because tribes continue to breathe life into them. We continue to speak their terms. We continue to remember the promises.
Okay, I'm gonna reshare the PowerPoint. And I'm gonna very quickly drop the link to both of these videos into the chat as well. Here's the one that we just watched. And then the first one that we watched as well. Again, I encourage you, if you have use for either of these in your networks, to please share. All right. Back to the PowerPoint. All right, so a little bit about tribal sovereignty and tribal governments. So, as was mentioned in the film, tribal sovereignty is something tribes have retained, not something granted to them by the federal government. So there is this distinct political relationship as well, right, between tribal governments and the federal government, which is very unique than other kind of racial categories or classifications of people. So being a member of a federally recognized tribe or being a federally recognized tribe, it's beyond just a racial affiliation. In fact, it's a political affiliation, right? So when we are engaging in, relationship building or partnership and collaboration with tribal governments, we are working with sovereign nations. And so we need to be giving sovereign nations that respect and deference that comes with that level of authority. As a part of being a sovereign nation, tribal governments generally have the authority to do many different things, ranging from selecting their own form of government. So Oriana mentioned this morning, that, tribes have to have, their own constitutions. A lot of those governmental structures were actually kind of passed to tribes, not necessarily traditional to how tribal peoples govern themselves. Some tribal nations are governing themselves in ways that do semblance much more kind of traditional forms of governance for those peoples. But it's going to really be different from nation to nation. Tribes have their ability to define their own membership criteria, and determining membership also going to look very different from nation to nation on how they do that, which is their, right and authority to do so. Enacting their own kind of laws and codes and enforcing those with some restrictions on their own lands. Tribes can provide for their own, establish their own law enforcement agencies or court systems. Now, that doesn't mean that all tribes do have their own law enforcement agency or court system. For many tribes, it comes down to either resources, right? Or even, perhaps a tribe being so small and having little to even no land base that perhaps it might not ever be feasible or, really necessary to have their own police force, for example, but you have, maybe larger tribes with larger membership and land base that, do have their own law enforcement agencies. A little bit about tribal courts in California, mentioned, 109 federally recognized tribes in California, yet there are approximately, I think, 22 tribal courts here in the state. Now, some of those are functioning in a more of a consortium model, but again, it comes down to resources. So tribes are not generating and have access to the same publicly funded, resource streams as do counties and states to be able to establish law enforcement agencies and court systems. In my experience, working again for, the largest tribe in California by membership, we were always kind of hustling to write grants, for example, to be able to not just fund, but also build, the building of our judicial systems, our judicial tribal systems. So, always like a hustle to continue to kind of build the pieces over time, which is, oftentimes very much the reality of tribes because we do not have access to the same funding streams. Beyond that, tribes are able to assert jurisdiction of their own peoples and lands and much more. But what I really want us to take away from this is that, while every tribe has, the authority to adopt their own, tribal codes and ways of governing their communities, again, it's going to look very different from tribe to tribe, and tribal social services are going to vary from tribe to tribe. So each tribal governance or tribal agency will have their own unique programming, their own unique staffing and services, their own unique resources for offering various services and staffing positions. They're going to have, various and different grant-funded initiatives with different deliverables. They're certainly going to have different decision-making processes, as well as, criteria for who's eligible for what services and so much more. So part of our responsibility is getting to know our tribal agency partners, learning about their services, learning about, their funding streams even. So for example, if there is a 3-year grant-funded program that offers various like parenting support programming, knowing that, 3 years of grant funding is not sustainable. So how can we as county systems, for example, help lift up that work, especially when, it's working really well in the space of prevention to keep families out of child welfare systems and support them in, whatever the family's, educational or social services or healthcare needs are and beyond. So we need to like really be cautious and not assume that, working with one tribe or tribal agency in one way is going to be the same of working with other tribes or tribal agencies. Tribes are going to handle cases differently. They're going to, again, have different services and processes for accessing services and more. I want to just give us a little bit of, in addition to the unique programming and services of the different 109 tribal governments here in California. And this was also mentioned in our presentation and conversation this morning, is that there's a multitude of other programs and services that exist outside of, tribal government umbrella. And this is not an exhaustive list at all. There are many programs and services in your own counties and your own regions that are, outside of this. There's going to be programs that support, say youth prevention programming, or certainly one thing that's not on here is, alcohol and other drug treatment services. But I just want to give you a little bit of just a brief snapshot of some of the kind of landscape throughout the state of California as it relates to programs and services that are and have been providing and doing this prevention work, again, for like decades and generations. Because we need to also bring in the full fold of our partners and build these partnerships, and again, figure out kind of where and how to uplift some of what's already happening and certainly what's already working. So I've just put together, and all of these are hyperlinked, and hopefully we will make sure that folks have access to all of the training materials. But for example, there are tribal TANF programs that serve every region and county here in California and are providing tons of prevention-based services. I've hyperlinked here. Did this jump over to the slide, or are you still seeing the PowerPoint? PowerPoint? Okay, let me stop share really quickly. And I'm gonna reshare. You see one tribal TANF organization. And you see here just a glimpse, I'm not going to go into this, but just a glimpse of some of the services that these programs are offering. Career development services, life skills workshops, youth services, right? Marriage promotion and counseling, parenting workshops, teen pregnancy prevention. There's so much happening. And we just need to do a little bit of a dig and understand and learn about what's happening in our communities. All right, I've also hyperlinked 2 Indian healthcare consortiums that oversee and support various healthcare clinics. So for example, the California Rural Indian Health Board, as well as the California Consortium for Urban Indian Health, they each have under their umbrella, several Indian health clinics where they provide, training and technical assistance and policy leadership, as well as do different like research and publications. But you can kind of navigate their websites and see they also have many initiatives that are focused on prevention. So in some instances, they'll funnel funding to specific tribal healthcare organizations, and other kind of public health prevention type work, and so much more. I really encourage you also to take a look at their websites. They also have hyperlinked all of the Indian health service organizations that are under their consortium. So you can go to those websites directly and see the work happening of tribal health organizations in your specific county, in your specific region. And again, they're all going to be different in kind of how they provide services. But, typically you have your standard, medical, dental, vision, and behavioral health services, but also so much more in the way of kind of prevention and community wellness and public health. Really, to me, also, helpful just to see kind of where, different healthcare orgs are located, but also acknowledging that some of our Indian healthcare clinics and organizations aren't just exclusively serving tribal members, tribal community members. For example, like Shingle Springs out in like the Placer County area, they serve the entire community. Right? They're providing healthcare and other prevention-based services to the entire community, regardless of what, background peoples come from. It's not just exclusive to tribal peoples and populations. There are Indian education centers that are doing very education prevention specific work in communities all over the state. And again, this is just like one snapshot. There are also many organizations doing fantastic work. So how do we support and build upon what's already working well, right? And then what does that really look like through an equity lens? So to me, how do we support what's already working well through kind of an equity-based lens is giving deference to tribes and tribal agencies. So who knows better or best when it comes to the unique strengths and challenges of tribal communities? Is it the county? Probably not. Is it the state? Probably not, right? It's the tribal providers and professionals and the communities themselves who know better or best when it comes to the best interest of their children and their families and their communities. So who are we to question that? Right? I really believe, and I say this and I emphasize this because this has not been my experience in collaborative type work as tribal orgs and providers and county and state orgs and providers and systems, right? Tribes are not always given deference as to what is considered expertise and who holds it and who knows better or best when it comes to the unique needs and challenges of tribal communities. Taking that one step further, really talking about and thinking about how are funds truly allocated in equitable ways, right? Tribes have been doing this work. Tribal agencies have been doing this work. Tribal communities have been doing this work for decades and generations. oftentimes extremely underfunded, understaffed, and not having the same access to resources that counties and states have. Right? To me, that's not equity. How do we support this work in ways that are truly equitable when thinking about dollars? And it's not all about dollars, but it is a lot has to do with dollars too, right? So how do we, as those who have access to the funding streams and dollars that tribes might not have direct access to in the same way, really disperse and allocate funds in equitable ways? Right? And how do we, even if a tribal agency has been doing this work for decades and generations, understaffed and underfunded, how do we come in and support the strengthening and building of that work, especially if it's work that's already working well? There's some great examples throughout the state, San Diego County, Madera County, where they have seen something and experienced something that is working with a tribal organization that is doing work to prevent families from coming into care. So San Diego County picked that program up and funded it and built that into their county budget. Madera County, there was a great program and is a great program that Chuck Chansey offers around kind of parenting support and education. Madera County picked that up when it got to a point where, funding might be running out because it's working. It's keeping families out of the system. So the counties so there are some examples of where counties can and have picked up that work to support what's working well. And our tribes truly partners. We're talking a lot about collaboration. We're talking about partnerships, but what does that really look like and mean, right? Our tribes truly a partner in the lead planning and decision-making processes from the beginning of state and county initiatives. And what does that look like in our jurisdiction, right? So not uncommon that tribes are kind of, oops, we forgot, and we're inviting you a little late, right, to the process and the table, right? And how are we acknowledging those missteps? How are we taking accountability when, we're still figuring it out and we're still learning? And sometimes we're not, we're making some mistakes along the way, right? This is human work. There is no formula to human work, but how are we taking accountability and also bringing tribes in from the beginning? Sometimes I use the analogy, like in child welfare work specifically, about like the tribe and the county being like in a co-parenting relationship, right? We're not together, right? But we have kids in common. And let's think about, kind of what we know about co-parenting, right? It's a spectrum. There's times when it's like parents can't even be in the same room. They can't even have a civilized conversation. It's toxic. There's a lot of healing that still has not yet been, kind of done. And then we can probably think about, examples of when co-parenting works really well and all parents and maybe even their new significant others are, at the decision-making table and at the events and cheering on the kids together, right? Without, the tension and the animosity. So how does a co-parenting relationship work then if one parent is like the funneler of the information, right? And the other parent doesn't always have access to all of the information or the resources, right? So for example, I've used the example of like just something as simple as like a parent-teacher conference, right? If only one parent knows when the conference is and has the authority to be like, yeah, Monday at 2:00 works good for me, right? And the other parent isn't even given an opportunity to be like, actually, Monday either does or doesn't work good for me. Or if they aren't even invited to the parent-teacher conference, but the one parent then fills them in afterwards, right? Oh yeah, we had a parent-teacher conference, this happened, we talked about that, here's kind of what we decided on moving forward of how we're going to support our child. Like, how is that to the other parent? There's a power imbalance, right? There's a power imbalance of how we come together and make decisions and provide input on what's best for our child. And again, if one parent doesn't have access to all of the information, right, doesn't have an opportunity to have similar access to the resources associated with parenting in a healthy way, access to the opportunities and the resources to do the healing so that we can grow in our capacity to be, kind of healthy, responsible parents, then there's an imbalance. There's an equity issue. So how are we thinking about our partnership with tribes and what is the information that tribes are given access to or have available to them? Is it all of the information, or is it some of the information and they're trying to make decisions with some of the information? Like, what does that do in the relationship? And what does that do in the process of partnering? Also, the process of acknowledging generations, and again, this was touched upon in our morning conversation as well, acknowledging generations of government-funded harm and missteps, and how are we committed to engaging in reparation-based work? I super appreciated the words of our behavioral health representative from Lake County in talking about kind of, it might not be that they were actions that I did decades or generations prior to me, but how am I taking responsibility and acknowledging as a representative of this governmental agency that has a history of harm, that has a history of not providing all of the information, that has a history of holding on to the resources and not giving an equitable opportunity for the other co-parent to come in and be a part of the process, right? How are we how are our actions and attitudes and relationships really including kind of this acknowledgement, right? And doing this reparation-based work, but also all of these pieces above. And what are we offering our tribal partners and not just asking of them, right? This is a reciprocal process. Like, relationships that are healthy are grounded in reciprocity, right? We give, we offer. So we oftentimes we ask our tribal partners for their time, their knowledge, their expertise, their participation in a million meetings. But what are we also offering? In addition to meeting our mandates and checking our boxes and doing what we are maybe, you know, regulatorily required to do, what are we actually offering in exchange for that time, that energy, that input, right? And showing up? What are we offering? And how are we leading with that? How are we leading with offering something and not leading with an imbalance of asking and taking? I think this is something really important and acknowledging, and that's part of like getting to know our tribal partners too. Like, you may be a department of, you know, a tribal social services department of one person. I mean, even in Oriana's like introduction, she's like, I'm the interim social services director. I'm the interim education director. I, you know, oversee our, you know, childcare administration. Like, that's a lot. So how much are we kind of tapping on Oriana to like show up and participate because we have a mandate to meet? But what are we offering? How are we offering to take something off of Oriana's plate, or offering resources in a way that potentially could take off her plate, and not just off of her plate, but really what are we offering this tribal program, agency, or government to participate and buy into the process in a way that they also see, feel the benefits of giving their time and energy and knowledge to. So reciprocity. And, you know, again, we're working with like a variety of tribal partners potentially, right? There are so many, you know, agencies and orgs doing great work. So really like also not narrowing our thinking to just who are the federally recognized tribes that we need to partner with and build relationship with and do this work. It was mentioned, you know, non-federally recognized tribe, but we've also talked about, you know, a variety of other agencies and orgs and service providers. So it might be certainly, you know, your tribal social services directors and or staff. You may be working with ICWA specific social workers or generalist tribal social workers. As mentioned again, you know, your TANF staff and workforce, tribal education and tribal Head Start and early Head Start staff, Indian Health Services, you know, orgs and providers, whether it be medical, behavioral health, or otherwise, elected tribal leaders. Like, when we have the privilege and honor of having elected tribal leaders a part of the conversation and at the table, that's a big deal. And that engagement should be viewed as similar to, you know, working with and engaging, you know, our state governor or other elected federal officials. That is a very high level elected official. So again, giving respect, giving reverence, and giving deference to, you know, having different folks in the room. And certainly could be a multitude of other tribal agency providers. I mean, there's programs doing work to support, survivors of family violence, folks doing work in the space of alcohol and drug, treatment, and so much more. And in what ways, right? Tribal providers as our partners in what ways? So, in thinking about, our very direct work, in assessments, for example, it's, those tribal providers, the tribes who often have extensive knowledge of the family and their history and the community, right? That really lend a much more kind of broad and probably holistic view of who peoples are, which is, much more broad than, what are, our structured assessment tool or our evidence-based tools are able to, even provide us. Tribes are our partners and tribal providers and our partners in helping in basic engagement and teaming with families, right? We know that there's a ton of historic mistrust because of the history and legacy of, federal Indian policy and the ways that, tribal peoples have been really let down by systems. So our tribal partners oftentimes can be really helpful in just helping engage and team with families and bring families in and helping to kind of build those bridges of trust. Tribes, of course, and often have extensive knowledge of services beyond those available in the mainstream. So what's happening in our community, what's working well, what does it look like to really co-create culturally relevant plans and services, as well as helping families navigate complex systems in identifying cultural connections and support for children and families, as well as in bridging the cultural humility gap between non-tribal providers and families, and then certainly in the planning and rebuilding of culturally responsive service systems that support families. Just a little bit kind of really briefly here, for those of you on the ground doing the direct work, sometimes it's maybe we're not, Oriana brought up data, we're not sure, who we're served, we're not collecting data or demographics on whether these are tribal clients that we're serving, for example. Is that a part of, your capturing of information and data? So sometimes it's a process of being sure that those questions are asked. If you are Native American, for example, or believe you may be affiliated with a tribe, there may be additional services and supports that are available to you, right? So these are creating opportunities to reach out, partner, refer to tribal organizations that really might benefit families in really meaningful ways. And then, I'm not going to go into this too far because we're almost out of time, but there is a link here on also what reasons why people might not claim to be American Indian that I find really useful and helpful. But I think that's a great starting point of knowing who we are serving and also who we're not serving and why maybe there are populations within our community or county that we're not seeing and we're not accessing. And what is it about kind of our service delivery and what adjustments might we need to make because there's populations of folks that just are not seeking our services. And sometimes it's because there are tribal orgs that are doing that work. So how do we partner and kind of, maximize resources in kind of serving similar populations? Also building upon conversation this morning, it's not just, showing up at the individual and family level, but how do you show up in community? How do you engage with the communities that you serve? Some great examples of going to tribally sponsored community events, being invited sometimes to table and share information about your services and resources, or just going and, bringing your own family or loved ones to really experience cultural sharing and supporting local Native artisans and really just engaging in cultural appreciation and learning, right? Because that really kind of lends to, establishing yourself as a trusted helper. Really just, direct and transparent communication. I appreciated also this morning, say what, what was it? Do what you say what you mean. And if you can't do something, be honest about that too. Just being yourself, being your authentic self, being human. And also, how do we take accountability for mistakes that are made? It might not be my mistake, but I'm a representative of this government agency who has a history of causing harm and who maybe has contributed to this family falling through the how can I take some accountability to build meaningful relationship? And then, you know, really reflecting as individuals, as organizations, as systems, how do we think others experience their interactions with us and the systems that we represent? And we know that by building relationships built on trust, transparency, and partnership, this historical trust can be overcome. Establishing ourselves as helpers, doing what we say we will do, and collaborating with other tribal organizations and service providers as equals and not as authority. And that brings us to the end of our time together. I've offered a few other resources, links here that you may find helpful to continue the learning. I will pause for any questions or conversations, but beyond that, thank you for sharing some time together with me this morning. And I hope that the remainder of today and into tomorrow are very beneficial, and a lot of great work will continue to happen together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Geneva, very much. That was a great presentation. Any question? Oh, he has the PowerPoint available. I was wondering the same thing.
Yeah, should I email it to you, Sarah, or how? Okay, great.
You can send it directly to me, and I think we're going to try to upload everything in the resources. Like if you look at the bottom of your toolbar, at least for me, it's bottom right. So we're going to try to get those uploaded into the resources tabs.
Okay, excellent. All right, I will absolutely do that. All right, thank you so much.
Before we break, we'll go to lunch next. Any questions for Geneva? All right, so we'll, as mentioned, take lunch till 12:30, and then you're going to go directly from the lobby into your afternoon session. So you'll click out of here and then use the lobby to access the afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
I'll email this to you right now, Sarah.
Perfect, thank you.
You.
And my understanding is folks will still have access to all they'll still have access to the lobby even after the event is done. So they can go back in and look for the resources and everything.
Oh, great, okay.
Geneva, do you want the chat conversation? I don't know if that would be helpful.
I'm just gonna scroll through it really quickly. Nice. I don't think it's anything that is necessarily needed to be preserved.
Okay. I'll save it just in case.
Okay, right on.
Thank you. Thank
Right,
you.
thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and log out, and I'll look forward to tuning into a couple more activities over the rest of the afternoon, hopefully.
For sure. Thanks so much.
Take care.
Bye.